We expect to hear live from the President later in this programme. With me now is Mark Harris. He's the Director of Olive Group's Crisis Response Services. His job is to negotiate hostage release. And joining me from Paris is the French journalist and commentator Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. Thanks both of you for joining us here on today's Global. Mark, to you first of all, how important a shift from the US is this to allow families to pay ransoms, not to cut off every avenue as a government?
I think the important thing here is the fact that it is now public from President Obama about the fact that families will not be prosecuted, which has been the case for many years. But I think to come public with it, I think is an interesting and important statement.
And Elizabeth, what is the perspective from France? Because, of course, hostages have been taken and released over the last few years.
Yes, and it's quite well known that companies and the government have paid for their release, sometimes rival groups, sometimes the groups that did the kidnapping themselves. And the French attitude to this is that throwing this into the open has no upside and a great deal of downside, because it's a message that you can make money out of captives, and it's going to be easier to get money out of the families and other parties. The French believe that you have to have plausible deniability. I think there's a great consensus in the country that it's not something we like admitting to, but there are times when it's needed. And it's something that you basically lie about to the rest of the world.
It's interesting.
We don't understand this way of waging secret policy publicly.
Yeah, it's interesting you talk about the denials, because that's frustrated senior Americans in the past. Let me just read you a quote from the former United States Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for African Affairs. The Europeans have a lot to answer for, she said. It's a completely two-faced policy. They pay ransoms, then deny any was paid. And then she went on to say, in terms of the consequences, the danger of this is not just it grows the terrorist movement, but it makes all of our citizens vulnerable. Is that a criticism that is accepted there in France, given what you said, that in the past you have paid?
There is a debate. There's a debate, should you pay because it encourages further kidnappings, and that's a real debate. But the thing on which there is more or less no debate is whatever it is that you do, don't explain to the world and therefore to the terrorists that you're going to do it. And every now and then we do send special forces. The French special forces have been able to recover kidnapped persons in Somalia, in other places, and there's always this uncertainty, and the French are pretty ruthless about these things. So the idea is, if you throw this to banks and negotiators, then it's open season for more kidnappings.
Okay. Let me bring Mark back in, because he deals with these sorts of cases. That's what you do now. Just tell me how you actually go about negotiating. Do you have to go through proxies? Governments in the past have been accused of actually giving money but wrapping it up in some sort of development aid. Has that ever been something that you've been involved with?
No, actually not. I have not been involved in that type of deal before. I think the important thing to remember here actually is the families in all of this, and putting government policies to one side. My experience in 20 years of operating in this industry is that if you are working either with a company or with a family and they are liaising correctly and appropriately with law enforcement in their home nation, with law enforcement in the nation where the incident has taken place, plus also in the event of a company with the government of the victim, then things can go forwards. But more importantly, those authorities are gathering evidence and are then able to close in on the kidnappers once the victim has been successfully released. And I think that's very important. I think it is making sure the family know that they are being looked after, that their best interests are at heart, and that they are working appropriately with law enforcement.
And just briefly on this point, one of the American proposals here is that they should have a central point, all the different agencies that James Foley's mother complained about having to deal with so frustratingly, just to have one central point. Is that helpful in a situation that you have to deal with?
Certainly. I mean, my experience today is if you have one person who knows and has experienced these events and is able to talk to it authoritatively and knows what everybody else is doing, I think it is hugely helpful to the families, and they must feel that everything is being done, and they must be briefed and briefed correctly.
And Elizabeth, let me bring you back in, because the New York Times looked at this about 12 months ago, and their investigation showed that since 2008, $125 million had been paid to kidnap gangs, many of them Islamist gangs, and that money principally had gone to propaganda, to training, to arms. There is a real worry, isn't there, if you shift policy on this and allow ransoms to be paid, that actually those gangs get stronger and it increases the chance of more kidnappings.
Of course it does. I think in many cases, especially in places like sub-Saharan Africa, actually you find out that it's less terrorism and much more just bandits making money out of it. But it's still, you know, the border is a bit vague on this one. Any policy that goes openly saying you may negotiate, you may pay, is something that makes the world more dangerous in the end.
Well, there we have to leave it. Elizabeth Moutet and Mark Harris here in the studio. Thanks to both of you for discussing this issue here on